For those not familiar, every mainline Final Fantasy has its own isolated cast of characters and story. There are a few things that transition from game to game to create a shared identity, but it's gonna be nothing that's gonna stop you from understanding the story and having fun. More or less, these are gonna be things that you'll appreciate as a fan going into your second or third Final Fantasy, such as the chocobos, the summons, or even the names of the magic abilities that you'll be able to use. We're gonna start with Final Fantasy 16, the latest installment in the franchise, and work our way back covering all of the mainline titles. Final Fantasy 16 takes place on a continent divided between 6 different nations that hold power based on their access to magical crystals and their dominance. Dominants are going to be humans that act as hosts for each nation's icon. These icons are going to be the summons that you'll traditionally see in other Final Fantasy games that correspond with different elements such as Ifrit, Shiva, and the Phoenix. Icons are generally designated to one of the 6 nations, which allowed the continent to maintain its balance. Being the dominant for an icon allows the human to take on aspects of that icon that provides them different abilities. Tensions between the nations begin to escalate as a magical drought called the Blight begins consuming the land. In the opening acts of the game, the main character Clive witnesses his kingdom be destroyed and his brother Joshua, who is a dominant and the host of the Phoenix icon, being murdered. This sets Clive on a journey to get revenge for his brother and his kingdom. Now, spoilerless previews for some of these games may sound weird to those who've played and beat them, but the goal of this video is just to give those who haven't enough information about the story and the gameplay to hook them in and decide on which Final Fantasy is best for them to play next. Combat in Final Fantasy 16 is fully action-based with AI-controlled party members. While in combat, you'll be focused on stringing together basic attacks with different icon abilities based on your playstyle and preferences. A core mechanic to the Final Fantasy series is going to be the staggering system. Now, the way the staggering works is after dealing a certain amount of damage, you can build up a stagger meter. Once that's maxed out, you'll stun your opponent for a short amount of time, and they'll take even more damage than normal during this period. Throughout Final Fantasy 16, you can expect to have several large-scale fights of icon versus icons that are going to require QTE inputs. In Final Fantasy 15, majority of the world is dominated by the Empire of Niflheim, who seeks the power of a magical crystal. This crystal is protected by the Lucian royal family that resides in the capital of Lucius, Insomnia, the last place that hasn't been taken over by Niflheim. Lucius has been at war with Niflheim for centuries, but thanks to the power of the magical crystal, they've been able to fend them off. But unfortunately, to use the power of that crystal, it's going to drain the king's life force. Due to the king's failing health, Lucius attempts to negotiate a peace treaty with Niflheim, but on the eve of those peace negotiations, Niflheim attacks the capital and steals the crystal. That was the nation's last line of defense, and they're taken over by Niflheim shortly after. From there, you'll play as Prince Noctis and his 3 close friends who together have like this boy band aesthetic, and you're gonna go on a road trip style adventure in a attempt to reclaim your kingdom from Niflheim. Now, when diving into Final Fantasy 15, there actually is a movie that acts as a prequel to this game that you should check out, or if you just want more information before you commit to buying it to see if you like the setup, be sure to check out the movie. Combat in Final Fantasy 15 is fully action-based, and battles take place in the open world environment. Since this was the first Final Fantasy game with full action-based combat, there are a lot of stopgap to help players get accommodated to the feel of switching from a turn-based franchise to more action-based. A signature of combat in Final Fantasy 15 is it uses a lot of teleportation and multiple weapons that can change combat during mid-battle that also fit just the overall, like it defines the aesthetic of the game. And when you see the gameplay, you're going to understand what I mean when you see all this teleportation around and then the multiple weapons just appearing out of thin air and you choosing which one you get to use when you go into combat. Now, if you haven't already, I really would appreciate it if you guys help me get this video to 100 likes and consider subscribing to the channel. I make tons of JRPG content like the video you're watching now, so if you like what you see, you won't be disappointed. But let's go ahead and hop back into the video. Final Fantasy 14 is one of 2 MMORPG installments in the Final Fantasy franchise. It's kind of out of left field, so it is a bit random, but it has a good reputation for what they've built in the game so far. Currently, it's one of the best MMORPGs on the market, winning several awards and garnering tons of praise from its player base. I won't even attempt to preview its story due to how detailed it is, but I can say that it's some of the best storytelling in the Final Fantasy franchise ever. The combat in Final Fantasy 14 is going to be fast-paced tab target system that grows the further you progress within the game. There are several classes, each with different playstyles, and you can change your class on the same character just by swapping weapons, but you will have to level up that separate class, and the roles that you can expect align with what you would see in an MMORPG. Final Fantasy XIV does get very in-depth with the number of skills each class has to offer, and the skill cap that it takes to play the in-game content such as Savage Raids. So yes, there are a ton of different classes that offer a significant variety of playstyles, whether it be in the DPS, or as a healer, or as a tank, and there's going to be a high skill cap for each of those classes, and a lot of skills to manage to have in your arsenal as you progress through some of these raids. I attempted to do Savage Raids, some of the most frustrating times in the world, but also some of the most rewarding when you completed it with that party. It just felt so good, and I felt just like mentally stimulated playing through the raids. Now, in-game content includes several challenging raids like I mentioned, dungeons, and trials, all designed with mechanics to test your coordination and skill as a team. They also support solo-friendly options for players who don't go into the game with the group, where you can search for parties and meet new friends and maybe find a guild going into the game, as opposed to having to do it already before you start playing. Now, we hinted at it, but the social aspects such as guilds and housing are also a major draw for new players. The Final Fantasy XIV community is extremely welcoming to new players, doing things such as progression parties, where a veteran player is going to come back and help new players learn mechanics to difficult raids. But now that I think about it, I think that one was called the learning parties. The progression parties are going to be a group of players who are going to go do a raid and continuously do it to progress, and they may not all already know the fight, but they go into it with that understanding, so that way you're not frustrated when someone keeps messing up, because you guys are all learning to progress. So we have the progression parties, and then we have the learning parties, which are two things that are just highlights of how welcoming the community is. Final Fantasy XIV has so much to offer, and this is just a brief overview, so I really recommend checking a more in-depth review if you enjoy MMOs and you're looking to get into the Final Fantasy franchise. Now, it is a grind to catch up to the current in-game content, but I would say that you really shouldn't view it like that. You should just be enjoying the experience, because it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience that you don't want to rush through, and as long as you're willing to commit, you're going to be rewarded diving into Final Fantasy XIV. I'm going to go ahead and make an executive decision to talk about Final Fantasy VII out of order due to its recent remake. Final Fantasy VII is easily one of the most iconic Final Fantasy franchises due to its success and integration into other franchises. As a kid, I was not familiar with Final Fantasy. I didn't play it. I thought it was too hard, or maybe I was just too dumb, but I did play Kingdom Hearts. And in Kingdom Hearts, when I saw Cloud and Sephiroth, I was just amazed with like everything that they added and how cool and badass they looked, but I wasn't able to play Final Fantasy. So growing up, I knew who these characters were. I even watched Advent Children, and at that point, I was waiting to play a Final Fantasy game whenever I felt like I was intelligent enough to be able to clear it. But I'm gonna stop talking about myself because I am exposing myself a little bit. Hey, I was a little bit smart as a kid, but not super intelligent. All right. Most gamers not familiar with Final Fantasy know who Cloud and Sephiroth are. Now, when it comes to playing Final Fantasy VII, you have options because there is its initial release or the modern day remake. Most games on this list have been re-released with updated visuals, but Final Fantasy VII is currently being remade as a modern day JRPG trilogy. The story is going to vary between the original and the modern day trilogy, so playing both is also a very solid option. Final Fantasy VII follows the journey of an eco-activist. It sounds a little bit crazy calling it eco-activist, but that's what they are. Fighting against the corrupt mega corporation Shinra Electric Power Company. Shinra is draining the planet's life energy known as Mako to fuel their dominance, and since they're draining the life force, it's threatening the balance of the world. The game begins with Cloud, a mercenary who joins a rebel group called Avalanche to take on Shinra. Pretty much, Cloud will just do anything as long as you pay him because he is a mercenary. And you'll start with the simple mission to sabotage the reactors, but that quickly escalates into a much larger conflict against Shinra. And this is the catalyst to the events that send you and your allies in pursuit of Sephiroth, the other iconic villain, who's a superhuman that seeks to wound the planet and harness its power to be reborn as a god. Along the way, you'll play as Cloud, who will meet several allies and enemies who are going to challenge your understanding of who Cloud is and his place within the world. Now, no shade at those who prefer the original Final Fantasy VII, but for the gameplay side of things, I'm going to discuss the remake, which may be more enticing to those newer to JRPGs and more accustomed to modern graphics. Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat is like the perfect blend between being an action-based game but still maintaining turn-based elements. Attacking enemies was gonna build your ATB gauge, and once it's full, you can either execute a spell or an ability with your weapon. Each party member is going to be playable and has a different playstyle that can be customized based on the way that you build the character, and you'll also gain skills once you have different weapons equipped. Now, in the original, they had a materia system, and in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the materia system is a more modernized version of the game's original mechanics that's going to allow you to customize your character by equipping orbs called materia. Now, these orbs grant abilities, magic spells, and passive effects that are going to enable deep customization based on your playstyle. You'll also be able to level up these materia to enhance their effectiveness. As someone who's newer to JRPGs, the Final Fantasy VII Remake has been my favorite iteration of combat in the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. I don't know if that's a hot take because I know a lot of people like turn-based, but I feel like this is just like the perfect blend. Final Fantasy XIII follows Lightning through 3 games: Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII-2, and Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. The story can get complex, especially if you're not fully paying attention and reading all the details and data entries, but I'll attempt to simplify it by redacting kind of some of the terminologies they use and simplify it that way. The game takes place in the floating world of Cocoon, whose government is ordering a purge of civilians who come in contact with Pulse, and Pulse is going to be the world below Cocoon that the government sees as a threat. The protagonist, who is a former soldier that goes by the name of Lightning, begins to fight against the government to save her sister, who has been marked by this godlike being from Pulse. Lightning is then joined by several allies who are also all marked by that same creature from Pulse. Now, being quote-unquote marked curses individuals with a divine mission that they must fulfill, or they risk being turned into a monster or a crystal. The crew begins to rally against the government of Cocoon while trying to discover their quote-unquote divine mission or their assigned task, and figuring out whether they can avoid being turned into monsters or crystals when they complete that divine mission. Gameplay can be linear for the opening portions of the game, but eventually it does open up. Combat is turn-based with Final Fantasy's signature ATB gauge. Now, the ATB gauge is a bar that fills up over time and determines when you can attack. You can control attacks manually or set auto battle, which will choose whichever action is best based on your paradigm that you have equipped when your ATB gauge is full. Now, the paradigm system allows you to control one leader while assigning roles such as Commando, Ravager, and Medic via the paradigms, instead of having you micromanage each character. So when you do a paradigm shift to a specific role, they're going to start doing actions based on that role. So obviously Medic would be focused on healing, for example. Since combat has an auto battle feature, this is going to be shifting the focus to doing paradigm shifting and taking advantage of timely staggers to dish out as much damage as possible. As I mentioned, there are 2 sequels to Final Fantasy XIII, so this is just a preview of the first game. Final Fantasy takes place in Ivalice, a medieval-inspired world where the Empire of Arcadia and Rosaria are stuck in an endless conflict. The small kingdom Damaska is caught in the crossfires and invaded by the Arcadian Empire after one of the Damascan captains betrays his country. That night, the king is assassinated moments after he signs the Treaty of Surrender, and the princess is also reported to be dead. This invasion of their homeland leads to a Damascan resistance movement to be started. 2 years after these events, the game picks up with Vaughn, a poor street kid coming into contact with a pair of sky pirates and the Damascan resistance as they assault the palace during the appointment of an Arcadian prince. There are many political conflicts to keep up with, but hopefully, as you're starting to see, this is a trend with Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy XII is the first game to get rid of the random enemy encounters, and it uses an active dimension battle system where you're gonna control one character while issuing commands to others and relying on the Gambit system. The Gambit system is an AI customization tool where you can set conditional if-then statements behaviors for your different party members, like attacking the nearest enemy or healing allies below 50% HP. It gets much more complex than that, but that's just a simple example. The ATB gauge is also present, which is going to dictate when you auto attack as you move around the battlefield, but you can also pause combat to use abilities, items, and strategize even further mid-battle. Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age, which is the remaster of the original game, also introduces a job system that lets you assign 2 out of the 12 unique classes to each character that's going to alter their stats and their abilities and the way that you can build them out. Another highlight for Final Fantasy XII is there's a ton of in-game content in the form of hunts and also hidden dungeons. Final Fantasy XI was the franchise's first attempt into the MMORPG genre, which was significantly different from all of the first 10 entries, which were going to be single-player games. Even though it was released in 2002, if you're interested in the game, it is still playable and has a decent-sized community still playing. Even though it does lack some quality of life features you expect in a modern MMO, there is an abundance of content to explore. I actually have a friend who got into Final Fantasy XI in like 2022, early 2023, and I haven't heard from him since. Every time I look on Discord, this man is playing Final Fantasy XI, so I presume that the gameplay loop has to be addicting. A highlight of Final Fantasy XI is its job system that allows you to choose a main job and a sub job from the 22 different classes available. Combat is very difficult and is going to be party oriented depending on skill chains and magic bursts to clear the content. You can play with AI companions, which eases this a little bit if you're not able to find a link shell to play with, and a link shell is going to be Final Fantasy XI's version of a guild. Now, Final Fantasy XI is a very grind heavy MMO, so if you plan to dip your feet in it, I really recommend finding a community to play with to make it even more enjoyable. Now, I'm attempting to do my best on all of these games, but I've never played Final Fantasy XI, so if there's anything that I missed for any of these Final Fantasies and you've played them, feel free to help me out in the comments below. Final Fantasy X is one of the most praised Final Fantasy games besides Final Fantasy VII, due to how much it improved on the Final Fantasy formula. Final Fantasy X, I believe, is the first Final Fantasy game to include voice acting, so from here on out, the rest of the stories will require mandatory reading. Ew, I know, but at times it's going to be worth it. Final Fantasy X follows Titus, a star blitzball player from the futuristic city of Zanarkand, who is mysteriously transported to the world of Spira after an attack by a colossal whale known as Sin. In Spira, Titus joins Yuna, a summoner, on a pilgrimage to defeat Sin, that whale that we just mentioned, and bring temporary peace to the land. To achieve this peace though, Yuna's gonna have to sacrifice herself, and that peace is only temporary until Sin returns in the future and they must send another summoner. Having this information makes the journey like extremely somber, because you know, like, you're investing and you're bonding with Yuna, and the rest of the party, you're seeing them bond with her and grow with her, while you know that she's marching to her eventual demise. This is all on top of the romance between Yuna and Titus, which adds another layer to the pilgrimage. The world building of Spira, the story twists, and the character development are going to create several unforgettable moments for you. Now, combat in Final Fantasy X and pretty much the rest of the Final Fantasies on this list are going to behave like you would expect in a traditional turn-based JRPG, and none of the walking around with the ATB gauge attacking that we've seen in Final Fantasy XI and XIII. Now, Final Fantasy X is going to utilize a visual turn order that can be manipulated with abilities like haste or slow to manipulate who gets to go first and delay the enemy's attacks. Progression for each party member is managed through the Spear Grid, which is a massive board where you'll unlock stat boosts and abilities. The Spear Grid provides flexibility, allowing you to customize your characters uniquely over time, and a lot of people either hate it or you love it because it can get complex. So you'll have your standard Spear Grid and you'll have your expert Spear Grid, each with varying levels of complexity and customization. With this combat system and character customization, boss fights are going to require strategic planning and like this on-the-fly adaptation to the unique mechanics that each boss has. And from here on out, all of the games are going to have random enemy encounters. So you just walk around the field, similar to Pokemon. I don't know if that's a good comparison, but like Pokemon, you walk around the field, you enter battle. Final Fantasy IX is another fan favorite and often regarded as the series' most heartfelt entry. The setting focuses on a war between nations in a medieval fantasy world called Gaia. The story begins with Zidane, a cheerful thief and a member of a group tasked with kidnapping Princess Garnet of Alexandria. During this mission, the princess is willing to join you to escape her oppressive life. Throughout your journey across Gaia, you'll be joined by several party members on your quest to take down Princess Garnet's mother, the Queen of Alexandria, who started the war. In this era of JRPGs, Final Fantasy combat was pretty straightforward, so I'll explain it here and kind of grace over it in the upcoming games. It's all turn-based, where you'll wait until your ATP gauge is full and then you're able to perform an ability. One unique thing about Final Fantasy IX is the fact that you also get abilities based on your equipment, whatever you have equipped, and then once you master it, that ability persists even when you remove that item. So this encourages you to maybe equip a weaker item and have to make that decision because you're trying to master that skill and maybe not whatever's best in slot. Unlike other games we've spoken about so far, Final Fantasy IX has set classes for each party member, limiting who can do what. Most of the game occurs on field screens consisting of pre-rendered backgrounds representing towns and dungeons that you'll traverse through. Now, as we talk about Final Fantasy VIII, I really just want to go back and say that even though I said that combat is pretty straightforward in this era of Final Fantasy VII through Final Fantasy X was this stretch of just Final Fantasy games that everyone loved, and probably some of the most loved Final Fantasy games within the series. And so by me saying the combat is straightforward, I am by no means saying that these games are not good. They just found a formula that everyone loved and continue to build on it bit by bit. Now, Final Fantasy VIII follows the lives of elite mercenaries trained at a military academy where students are taught combat, strategy, and magic. Now, the main protagonist, Squall's journey begins with his graduation and subsequent deployment into a conflict involving a rival nation, a mysterious evil sorcerer, and a resistance leader named Renoa. While executing your missions as a member of SEED, you'll encounter a diverse cast of characters, each with their own motivations and backstories. Final Fantasy VIII utilizes the junction system, which is a complex and polarizing mechanic that replaces traditional leveling and stat progression. Magic is drawn from enemies during battle, or found in the world and then equipped to stats, or utilized to cast spells in combat. So you couldn't just cast an infinite amount of spells, you had to go draw out those numbers from enemies, and that would be your stock pool of spells that you can use. Different spells though enhance different stats. So for example, a Fire Gun would boost your strength if you were to equip it to a stat, while Cura would boost your HP. This system allowed for highly customizable builds that can be pretty difficult to pick up, because you have to balance using your spells to dish out damage while also using them to invest in your stat progression. As I mentioned, it is a polarizing system, so generally you'll either love it or you'll hate it. Now with Final Fantasy VIII, the enemy's levels scale with yours, so at times leveling can be a bad thing, but it's also required for you to draw magic to increase your stats and your magic pool. So it's not one of those games where you can go grind infinitely to get overpowered and just crash through everything. Everything is going to exponentially grow with you. So we spoke about Final Fantasy VII earlier, and now we're at Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasies 1 through 6 are going to be the 2D era of Final Fantasy. They can be bought together in a package called the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. They all incrementally build on the foundations of combat for the franchise, but are very similar to one another, or what we can expect today in a turn-based JRPG. That being said, I'm just going to be highlighting the stories of these entries going forward. So in Final Fantasy VI, the story begins with Terra being in a world where magic is thought to be extinct and technology reigns supreme. Terra becomes entangled in an imperial plot to control the forgotten magical power. Throughout the journey, the story though does expand to 14 different main characters, and it doesn't just focus solely on Terra being the main protagonist. A group of rebels called the Returners unite in their quest to resist against the Empire's iron grip. The story evolves into a tale of war, betrayal, and search for freedom. With the rise of an ancient evil and the growing threat of the Empire, the group known as the Returners are going to have to face powerful enemies, uncover lost secrets, and come to terms with the true nature of the forces that control their fates. Final Fantasy V takes place in an elemental world where the balance of nature is sustained by 4 elemental crystals: wind, water, fire, and earth. Now these crystals are the lifeblood of the planet, powering everything from wind currents to magical phenomena. In Final Fantasy V, the story begins with the wind crystal mysteriously being shattered, causing wind to be still. This event sets off a chain reaction that threatens the stability of the remaining crystals. The protagonist Bartz, while investigating a fallen meteor, meets Lena, Galuf, and Ferris, who reveal the danger facing the other remaining crystals that control the world's elements. During this event, the 4 are granted new powers and designated the protectors of those crystals. It's then revealed to them that these crystals act as a seal to an evil sorcerer. And this sets you on the journey where Bartz and his party must keep these crystals from being exploited to prevent that evil sorcerer's resurgence. Final Fantasy IV follows Cecile, a dark knight and the captain of the elite Red Wings airship fleet, who begins to question the morality of his king after witnessing a peaceful village be destroyed on his orders. When Cecile is tasked with a dangerous mission that leaves him questioning his loyalty and honor, he sets on a journey of redemption. The quest leads to the group to confront not only external enemies, but also fight their own inner demons. Final Fantasy III revolves around 4 orphan children drawn to the Crystal of Light. The crystal grants them some of its power and instructs them to go forth and restore balance to the world. Not knowing what to make of the crystal's pronouncements, but recognizing the importance of its words, the 4 of them inform their adoptive families of their mission and set out to explore and bring back balance to the world. We're speedrunning these, but Final Fantasy II centers on 4 youths whose parents were killed during an army invasion by the Empire of Palamecia. Now, the Empire of Palamecia are using Hellspawn to conquer the world. 3 of the 4 main characters join a rebellion against that empire, embarking on missions to gain new magic, weapons, and destroy the enemy's super weapons to rescue the leading member of the resistance. As they fight for their freedom, they uncover ancient powers and also allies that can help them turn the tides of the conflict. Final Fantasy I begins with the arrival of 4 mysterious warriors known as the Warriors of Light, each carrying a darkened crystal. The land's elements, earth, fire, water, and wind, are in disarray, and the party must embark on a quest to restore balance by confronting the evil forces corrupting the crystals. They are prophesized to restore balance to the world by rekindling the light of the crystals and vanishing the sources of corruption. As the journey unfolds, the Warriors of Light must prove themselves in the world to test their strength, resolve, and unity. So that's going to be all of the mainline Final Fantasies explained. This was a big project, so if I made some mistakes, please give me a little bit of grace and help me out in the comments so that way we can get more fans introduced to the Final Fantasy series and join this much loved franchise. But if you're interested in other JRPG series, check out this video right here where I explain every JRPG franchise in 15 minutes. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch you in the next one.